Day 730. Monday, November 10th. Introduction to the New Testament, Part 2. Daily Deep Dive. Background to Matthew. Matthew is the author, and his name means gift of God, but he's also called Levi in Mark and Luke, which is of Hebrew origin and means joined to. Many people had more than one name, which was common in multicultural settings. Levi would have been his Hebrew birth name, while Matthew would have been his Greco-Roman name. Mark and Luke call him Levi, likely because they wanted to highlight his Jewish identity. Even in our world today, people who immigrate to another country often take a name of that country that is easier for people of that culture to say, and identifies that as a part of that new culture. He's also called son of Alphaeus in Mark 2:14. Matthew lived in Capernaum, at the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. This was a profitable spot due to the fishing and a major road, the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, which ran from Babylon to Egypt. Matthew was a tax collector, also known as a publican in this city area, which likely made him a fairly wealthy man. We know he has a big enough house to host a number of people and throw a banquet. While the Gospel books do not contain anything denoting who authored them, the early church leaders were unanimous in stating that Matthew wrote this account. The account seems to be written to a Jewish or Jewish Christian audience. Here are some of the reasons for that assumption. And Matthew's account is focused on the fulfillment of the Old Testament. He has more quotations from and allusions to the Old Testament writings than any other New Testament author. The tracing of Jesus' genealogy from Abraham. He gives little to no explanation on Jewish customs such as ritual washings, circumcision, etc., which makes sense if the audience was already well familiar with Jewish customs. And he uses common Jewish terminology, such as kingdom of heaven versus kingdom of God. Jews wanting to protect against violating the third commandment were reluctant to use the name of God. The terms, however, are interchangeable. It focuses on Jesus as the son of David, which would have resonated with a Jewish audience who was looking for the Messiah to be from the line of David. Why would Matthew record this account? After Christ's resurrection and ascension, the apostles served as eyewitness teachers who could answer the questions of new Christians. As a result of Rome's persecution against Christians, the church was scattered, and there was no longer a central unified body of believers in close proximity to the apostles. The need arose for there to be an authoritative recording and witness of the teachings of Jesus Christ and his experiences. Matthew would emphasize that Jesus was the Messiah from the line of David. Matthew would emphasize that while Jesus was king, that his messianic kingdom was not yet set up on earth. We tend to think that all the gospel accounts were recorded in chronological form, but this is not true. Matthew, Mark, and John were all Jewish. Luke appears to have been a Gentile. Jewish thinking is very different than our Western thinking. Western thinking is very linear, but Eastern thinking, which includes Jewish thinking, can be grouped around ideas and themes. Each gospel writer writes to a somewhat different audience, and they include and exclude and arrange their material in a way to try to get their message across to their particular audience. What language was Matthew written in? This is debated. Some scholars feel Matthew was written originally in Hebrew. However, it's important to note that there are no manuscript scraps or anything found that would provide any evidence this is true. They base this belief on a quote from Irenaeus, who may or may not have been part of the true church. In the 300s AD, Eusebius quotes Irenaeus as essentially saying that Matthew recorded his account in his native tongue, which they take to mean Hebrew. However, it could mean Aramaic or Hebrew. It's also possible, even likely, that Matthew, who likely was able to write, which would have been necessary as a tax collector, may have originally recorded Christ's exact phrases in Aramaic or Hebrew, depending on the real spoken words of Jesus Christ, and then later, when compiling them into the final form, recorded his account in the common Koine Greek language of the empire. When was this account written? Most believe that Matthew was written between 65 to 70 AD, which likely makes it the third account to be recorded. Background to Mark. Mark is the author of this account, not by direct statement, but by unanimous testimony of the early church. His name was John Mark or John, also called Mark, Acts 12:12-25 and Acts 15:37. John was of Hebrew origin. Jehovah is a gracious giver. John Mark was the cousin of Johnmus, see Colossians 4:10. The Greek word avekios in classic Greek could mean either nephew or cousin, but by the 1st century it no longer had the meaning of the older classical sense of nephew, and was being used exclusively to refer to cousin instead. By the time of Paul, another Greek word was being used for nephew, abepsilon lam diuk. This is supported by the following: LSJ Liddell Scott Jones, cousin, later Greek. BDAG, the leading NT lexicon. Cousin, the son of one's uncle or aunt, explicitly not nephew. LXX, Septuagint usage, consistent with cousin or kinsman. It appears from 1 Peter 5:13 that Mark learned directly from Peter, and has a close relationship with him. It's wondered whether John Mark came into contact with the gospel through Peter, in Acts 12:12. It seems Peter calls Mark his son, in a spiritual sense, similar to how Paul calls both Timothy and Titus his sons. Mark likely received from Peter various stories and teachings of Jesus Christ that he compiled together. Early Christians like Papias, early 2nd century, said that Mark wrote down Peter's eyewitness memories of Jesus. However, Papias stated that Mark did not record them in order. It's also worth noting that Mark does not record some of these moments of Peter's life that other gospel writers record that may have been embarrassing to Peter, such as walking on water but losing faith, etc. Mark begins traveling with Paul and Barnabas in Acts 12:25 and helps them during their first missionary journey, Acts 13:5. But later leaves them to return to Jerusalem, Acts 13:13. We will talk more about the likely impact of this on the relationship between Mark and Paul when we get to Acts 15:36-39. Mark is also Jewish as far as we know, but his audience appears different than Matthew's. Evidence seems to suggest that the audience was the church at Rome, or at least a Gentile audience. Mark explains Jewish customs which he wouldn't have needed to do if his audience was Jewish. See Mark 7:2-4 and Mark 15:42 of examples, where he goes out of his way to explain what he is saying. We see that Mark translates Aramaic words into Koine Greek. See Mark 3:17, 5:41, 7:11, 15:22 and 15:34. Mark also includes several Latin phrases, which again would be meaningful to a Gentile audience, not meaningful to Jewish audience. Latin was still very common in Rome, but used very little at that time outside of the city of Rome. Latin examples include centurion, kevto pivov, centurion, meaning a Roman military officer over 100 men. The use of this Latin term, instead of the Greek hekatontarchus, reflects Roman military language, and suggests Mark's audience was familiar with Roman titles. And legion. IUV, legion. A unit of the Roman army, roughly 6,000 soldiers. Praetorium, patrium, praetorium. The governor's headquarters, often associated with the judgment hall or military palace. A Roman administrative term, reflecting imperial authority. Of the Roman guard or executioner sent to behead John the Baptist. Another Roman military title, rarely used outside Roman contexts. It seems clear that Mark's account is the most Roman of the four Gospels. It's also the shortest of the four Gospels. Mark's account seems very focused on action, which makes sense through the lens of a Roman audience. The Roman Empire was far more interested in action than teaching. In that culture, one would receive a task, job, commission, move to carry it out, and then report back as quick as possible that they had successfully accomplished their mission. It seems Mark wants to demonstrate what Jesus Christ did, and less about what he taught, that Jesus Christ was a man of action. The Gospel of Mark contains a sense of urgency or rapid action. Over 40 times Mark uses the Greek epsilono, which means forthwith, immediately, straightway. While the dating of the Gospel of Mark varies greatly, most scholars seem to date it around 65 to 70 AD. The famous fire of Rome occurred in 64 AD, and Emperor Nero blamed this blaze on Christians, which resulted in widespread persecution from around 64 to 67 AD. Mark may have been preparing his readers for such a time of persecution. Compare Mark 8:34-38 and Mark 13:9-13. The major themes of the Gospel of Mark are 1. Jesus as the servant king, the Son of God who came not to be served but to serve. Mark 10:45. His divine authority is evident through miracles and power over nature, demons and disease, yet his path leads to suffering and death. Mark shows that true messiahship involves sacrifice, not worldly glory. 2. The kingdom of God. As opposed to Rome's empire, Mark opens with Jesus proclaiming, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is at hand." Mark 1:15. The kingdom is both present in Jesus' ministry and future, to be fully realized at his return. Discipleship and the true cost of following Jesus. Mark shows that discipleship involves learning through failure and being transformed by humility and service. Mark 8:34-38, 9:35. Faith versus fear. The woman with the issue of blood. The woman with the issues and paralyzed by fear or unbelief, for example. The disciples in the storm. This tension challenges readers to trust God, even when he seems hidden or silent. Mark 4:45-36. 5. The true identity of Jesus. Mark repeatedly raises the question, who is this man? From the crowds, to the disciples, to the centurion at the cross. Mark 4:41-15-39. The Gospel gradually reveals that Jesus is both Messiah and Son of God, but not the kind of Messiah people expected to come. 6. Urgency in action. Mark's frequent use of the word immediately, epsilon, thetopsilons, gives the Gospel a sense of urgency and movement. Jesus is constantly in motion, healing, teaching, casting out demons, etc.